Before we begin this episode about reading, I want to say there's lots of neurobiology, measurement instruments, and brainwaves, sometimes called oscillations or frequencies. However, I will hopefully provide easy to understand analogies. We will go through the entire reading process from the moment light hits the retina to formulating speech. We will also compare so-called normal readers, the autistic phenotype, and dyslexia, and at times, the odd contrast of the autistic phenotype and dyslexia. Today's episode is all about reading. We will discuss the reading process, the neurobiology, of course, a breakdown of visualizing the text and transforming that into understanding, comprehension, how to formulate that into speech. You will find out, if you don't already know, we use speech even when silently reading to ourselves. 100% of autistics have a problem, some sort of problem, with speech and language. We will also explore the spelling issues, why and how some people, especially autistics, can get caught up on reading fluency. We will discuss dyslexia and several brain regions. Reading is a sophisticated cognitive process that transforms written text into meaning through a left lateralized brain network. Considering the autistic phenotype's fast sensory processing, let's start before the brain even makes sense of the words, which is in the little nuclei in the occipital temporal lobe, which is a combination of the occipital and temporal lobes, called visual word form area, VWFA. We'll talk a lot about that later. Let's start with the retina. When you look at a word like dog on a page, light hits your eyes. You probably know about the rods and cones and then the retinal ganglion cells that track back through your thalamus. The thalamus is going to be a first stop here, the lateral geniculate thalamus. We talked about this with the oxytocin, the magnocellular and parvocellular types of cell types used for vision. Now, also remember the lateral geniculate is right there by the midbrain. It essentially reaches out and high fives things like the superior colliculus and so forth from the midbrain discussions. So from the lateral geniculate, the optic nerve to the primary visual cortex, which is V1 in the back of your brain. V1 is active 50 to 100 milliseconds. This is like a sketch artist, just kind of mapping out the drawing. And this is spotting the lines and curves of the D or the O for the dog example. EEGs catches this spike, and fMRI shows the V1 lit up. MEGs confirms it's the first stop with precise timing. Next, secondary visual areas, which is V2, V3, and V4, take over from 100 to 150 milliseconds. They're like puzzle builders. They are just piecing together these lines into letters and shapes, ensuring, for instance, that D isn't a B. EEG shows early signals before the N170, and MEG maps connections to V1, and fMRI pinpoints these areas. V4 starts saying, by the time we get to the last visual process here of the visual cortex, V4 says, this is text. This isn't something insignificant. This is all happening before the visual word form area recognizes this as dog. Hard stop here. A cool side note, kind of independent from this conversation about autism, dyslexia, and reading. And this is how blind people kind of repurpose. They have neuroplasticity in this V1 through V4 areas for reading tactile in the Braille. And they also repurpose these V1 to V4 areas for auditory sensations. So there's kind of a heightened area here. Words like amazing and fascinating don't even describe how wow this is. Now, here's how it works. Typically, congenitally blind individuals or those that lost their eyesight early in life will better repurpose these areas. And these V1 to V4 areas are recruited for that sensory processing with the Braille. Neuroplasticity in the human living organism is wild. So let's talk about two different things here that's been mentioned several times across the podcast. One is the so-called heightened sensory processing. And the mechanism by which this happens is neural oscillations, or brain waves. We talked about those both in several episodes, but let's expand on those. Often I've mentioned the waves and not really having direct order, but let's clarify this. The lowest oscillation is delta, 0.5 to 4 hertz. Theta, 4 to 8 hertz. Alpha, 8 to 12 hertz. Beta, 13 to 30 hertz. And then there's gamma, anything over 30. However, gamma has two different kind of stages. Low gamma, which is 30 to 80 hertz, and high gamma, over 80 hertz. The best way to think about this, I think, is if you have one child learning, let's say you're in a traumatic experience or near tragic. Maybe you're driving in the road and somebody runs a stoplight and it almost hits you, or it does hit you. At that moment, your body is sent into these high gamma waves. This means your body is going to remember this incident much easier. This is the biggest thing with trauma. People that experience a traumatic experience, their body, just all of these brain waves are sent into high gamma. This is the so-called origin of one trial learning. It only takes you one time to really learn from that experience. Another example is if you touch a stove or touch something hot, you typically remember not to touch that again. However, independent of this one trial learning, everything operating on our insides are running on these oscillations. They are constantly on oscillations. This is a big indicator of our so-called internal states as well. Calm or excited, stressed or relaxed, whatever the case may be here. Just insert whatever. So let's talk about the sensory processing between non-autistics versus the autistic phenotype, especially with reading. So the different brain waves or frequencies, neural oscillations and so forth. In non-autistics, V1 through V4 is operating at alpha waves and beta waves. Alpha helps you focus, like ignoring distractions while reading dog. Beta links the V1 to V4, ensuring those letter shapes come together smoothly. EEG picks up alpha suppression when you're engaged, while MEG shows beta connections between visual areas. Gamma waves over 30 Hz are there too, but they're less dominant, helping fine-tune details, like making sure the O in dog isn't a C. Unlike in autism, where gamma waves go into overdrive, non-autistic brains keep a balanced mix, ensuring efficient processing without getting stuck on every detail. fMRI supports this by showing steady activation in V1 through V4, not the hyperactivity in autism. In the autistic phenotype, it's mostly or completely entirely all gamma waves. This is the so-called heightened. So let's start making sense of what the eyes, the retinas, are sending back to the rest of the brain, starting in the occipital lobe. The visual word form area in the occipito-temporal cortex recognizes letters and words as visual patterns, acting like a pattern detector to identify familiar shapes and sequences, such as distinguishing dog from bog. The temporal-parietal cortex, including the superior temporal gyrus and the angular gyrus, maps these visual forms to sound, enabling mental or vocal pronunciation, like sounding out dog as dog. The inferior frontal gyrus, which does include Broca. We're not limiting this area to just Broca, however. It does include two more little nuclei involved in this process, involved with integrating word meanings, akin to a storytelling piece together a narrative to understand that dog refers to a pet. These regions are linked by the arcuate fasciculus, a white matter tract facilitating communication for phonological and semantic processing that ensures seamless coordination. If you remember the speech and language episode, we spent a lot of time on the arcuate fasciculus. It's a white matter tract connecting Wernicke and Broca. Remember, these are two distal areas. Functional magnetic resonance imaging measures blood flow to pinpoint active regions, showing robust visual word form area activation for word recognition, coming at 150 to 200 milliseconds. And this is using an N170 for EEGs or M170 for MEGs. These are the same instruments we talked about in part 2 of the sensory processing episode. Same stuff. EEGs capture electric brain activity with millisecond precision, and this detects rapid neural responses, like N170 for visual processing, and 400, so roughly 400 milliseconds for the meaning. MEGs measure magnetic fields, and this offers precise timing and moderate spatial resolution, so within 2 to 5 millimeters, to map connectivity between the visual word form area and the superior temporal gyrus. The temporal-parietal lobe handles phonological processing, roughly 200 to 300 milliseconds, and the IFG, the inferior frontal gyrus, supports the semantic integration, happening roughly at 300 to 500 milliseconds. The dual stream model, the so-called dual stream model here, includes a ventral stream. This includes the VWFA and the semantics for familiar words, like instantly recognizing dog, and a dorsal stream, that temporal-parietal for phonology, for decoding new and pseudo words. Hard stop. The pseudo word, for example, zob. We will discuss this a little bit, but you should know that pseudo words are very common in achievement type tests given to mostly kids. These are things like the Wyatt 4, the Wechsler Individual Achievement Test, or the KTEA, the Kaufman Test of Educational Achievement. These are very common types of tests used in psychological assessments or school assessments, school placement type of activities here. Diffusion Tensor Imaging, DTI, also talked about in the part 2 of the sensory processing episode, reveals higher fractional anisotropy in the arcuate fasciculus, indicating a strong connectivity here, which predicts reading fluency. So in other words, the higher this connection here, the better the reading fluency. So it might be a good time here to kind of describe this fractional anisotropy. Here on after, I'm going to call this FA. It's just easier. I'm going to give some easy to understand examples here. This is measuring water. The DTI, Diffusion Tensor Imaging, is measuring water. Diffusion is just nerd speak for movement. So how water is moving throughout the brain is what this is doing. With these different connections, even distal connections. We talked about myelin. Myelin being like the difference in myelin, well myelination, like driving on an interstate versus a gravel road. FA, it's measuring this number. 1 is optimal, like massive amounts of water flow. 0 is no good. There's some disruption going on. So like the gravel road. So the higher the better. And if you think about the myelin being straws having a good water flow, but if there are kinks in the straws, or the straws are narrow versus wide straws, there's going to be a disruption of water flow. If you think about a garden hose, if you have kinks in the garden hose, the water coming out at the end is massively implicated. The pressure and water flow here is very weak. It's very frustrating if you're using a garden hose. And that's delaying. It's delaying this distal connection in the brain. So those receiving regions, postsynaptic connections and so forth, are delayed. And we've talked about this in the sensory processing, where the earlier stops are heightened, but the distal connections are kind of slowed or impaired. And this is going to come into play later when we talk about autistics, reading, and that heightened visual processing, and dyslexics having a weakened FA with these distal connections. It's going to all make sense, I hope. Silent reading involves something called subvocalization, or silently speaking. Readers here internally articulate words, engaging in phonological areas, with less of the IFG activating than oral reading, which recruits the pre- and post-central gyri for motor coordination and speech production. Now, we are silently speaking to ourselves when we are reading, because we are speaking up to the cortex and other strong areas of the brain. We are teaching ourselves what is being read. This is a huge part with learning. The overall goal of this network here is to efficiently decode the text and convert it into sound and derive meaning, enabling fluent reading measured as words per minute. So either way, reading to the self or out loud, you are essentially speaking. So let's break down the reading process. Step 1 is we are decoding, something called orthographic processing. And this involves the VWFA, that visual word form area, to identify letters and words as those visual patterns, like recognizing book on a page as familiar shape, occurring within 150 to 200 milliseconds. fMRI shows that this VWFA activation and EEG captures the rapid electrical spike, and the MEG localizes it to the occipital temporal cortex. Remember from the Sensory Processing Part 2 episode, EEGs are much better at kind of local distinguishing, local findings and so forth. And EEGs are much easier to use, less dangerous even. However, MEGs are better for distal connections, kind of spotlighting the whole brain to see what is all active. The VWFA's goal is to quickly and accurately process visual word forms, preparing the brain for sound and meaning. This is step 1. So what does processing visual word forms mean? This involves the brain's ability to recognize and interpret written words as visual patterns, a key step in reading. This process primarily engages the VWFA for that initial recognition, identifying letters and words. This is going to be orchestrated by this rapid visual processing that relies on the brain's ability to match that visual input stored to the orthographic representations. Does the brain recognize this sequence of letters that make up this word? Does the brain recognize this? The role in reading here is huge. This step prepares the brain for subsequent phonological mapping and the semantic integration. This is like step one. If your dominoes are off and the first domino is off, the second, third, fourth, everything downstream is going to be delayed. And this is facilitated by the arcuate fasciculus. Once again, so the arcuate fasciculus is involved in reading and speaking. In fluent readers, this VWFA enables automatic word form processing. It automates it. This is what the central nervous system is trying to do with everything. And this contributes to efficient decoding. So some disruptions in this, for instance, in dyslexia, the VWFA is underactive. And this leads to delayed N170 and impaired word recognition. However, the data for autism shows hyperactivity of the VWFA, and that bilateral activation reflects a visual spatial bias and enhances the decoding speed, but not always comprehension due to the frontotemporal underconnectivity. We've talked about this a lot with autism. Those heightened connections early in processes, but then downstream, it gets delayed, it gets disrupted, those more distal connections. And you should not be surprised here with this hyperactivity of the visual word form area because of the visual processing, those high rates of speed with visual processing. Another area from the Reza Shadmir episode, the cerebellum. This is a very underrated area, and we'll talk a lot about the cerebellum today. Purkinje cells in the cerebellum refine the timing and coordination of the eye movements. These are often called saccades. And needing to scan word forms, this is what it's trying to accomplish here, with climbing fiber afferents, correcting errors in real time, and parallel fibers integrating visual cues. In dysfunction, as seen in the autistic phenotype, with Purkinje cells, 25 to 50% cell loss in the autistic phenotype for Purkinje cells. And in the dyslexia, there's a disruption of this precise affecting fluent word form processing. So this process is foundational to reading, linking the visual input to the sound and meaning through a coordinated neural network. This is not about turning the word into visual thinking. It is about seeing the pattern of the letters for reading the word. So spelling difficulties. This is an area of interest here for us. Particularly if you remember from the Kanner kids and Asperger kids, as well as those with dyslexia and or the autistic phenotype as a whole, are best explained by challenges in the orthographic processing phase here, with additional contributions from related stage and neural networks. The primary point in spelling is the orthographic processing, and this is occurring. This phase that involves the visual word form area for the decoding process. Now, if you think about it, think about that hyperactivity in autism. With autism, you know about that black and white thinking as well. This hyperactive VWFA with that bilateral activation, this leads to a hyper focus on spelling, but a poor integration with phonology or semantics due to that frontotemporal underconnectivity. Again, more of the Purkinje cells are involved here, and an area that we've recently discussed over the last winter in several episodes, the dorsal striatum. The dorsal striatum is our input area of the basal ganglia. I know a lot of regions here, a lot of different brain regions here, but they're all very important and fascinating. The dorsal striatum is the input areas of the basal ganglia. In other words, this is what's going to coordinate or conduct the downstream movements. Remember, the basal ganglia is go and no-go area. And two big things here with the dorsal striatum is it's heavily involved in learning and goal-directed activity and habitual responses. Remember autism and those habitual responses or the lack of adaptive responses. We can get caught up on things very easily. A second consideration for spelling difficulties here is following the orthographic recognition, which is the phonological processing. This is involved with that temporal-parietal cortex, the superior temporal gyrus and the angular gyrus, those two specific areas. And this maps spellings to sounds. Disruption of the cerebellar timing via the Purkinje cells affect Broca area for articulation, and this can hinder spelling by sound. And this leads to phonetic misspellings. For example here, phone, F-O-N-E, for phone. It's very confusing. The Kanner kids were so funny with this, if you read the Leo Kanner 1943 paper. Another region of interest is the arcuate fasciculus. This tract reduces with that FA in dyslexia, remember that water flow, and with the autistic phenotype, the connection between phonological output, the Broca's area, and comprehension, Wernicke's area. This disrupting the feedback loop. All of these things are basically running in a loop, updating each other. And this is needed to verify spelling correctness. In the autistic phenotype, underconnectivity further complicates integrating spelling rules. There's a downstream area here for the semantic integration we haven't discussed yet, but with spelling, it's important to mention this now. That inferior frontal gyrus, remember, including the Broca area, links spellings to meaning. But this is delayed using N400 in the autistic phenotype. So roughly 400 milliseconds. This is supposed to come online. But that is due to the frontotemporal deficit, that underconnectivity. In dyslexia, there's an overactivation, and this can lead to semantic-based spelling errors. The examples here are something like there, T-H-E-I-R, for there, T-H-E-R-E, when meaning is more important than orthography. Okay, so meaning is more important in this situation than the orthography part. Spelling difficulties indicate kind of a bottleneck in the orthographic encoding, often exacerbated by the cerebellar cortical loop disruptions. I remember in the 3rd grade, anecdotal time I guess, I remember spelling movie, M-O-V-E, and I got it wrong, of course, M-O-V-I-E, and I just remember sitting there thinking, looking at movie, M-O-V-E is like, no, that's right. I was just completely lost. It doesn't make any sense. If you find yourself easily confusing and getting stuck on words like accept and expert while reading, or words like expectation, extinction, or extermination, like I do, all of those words kind of look the same. I still get caught up on this, even at 45 years old. This is likely happening at the orthographic processing phase, with potential considerations or contributions from subsequent stages. We have all of these words spelled the same, but have multiple meanings, or said the same with different spellings. Many different if-then rules in language. I just cannot unsee Genesis 11, 1 through 9 now, especially verse 9. And that's in large part thanks to Veritas. At 44 Veritas on X, he really captured that for me. The Tower of Babel. And it's just babble. Humans love babble. A primary point here with that example like accept and expert. why confusion occurs here with the similar letter patterns, except EX, CEPT, and expert, EXPERT, share initial letters EX. And this can lead to visually similarity confusion if the FWVA struggles to distinguish subtle differences. And both words have a downstream E, P, and T. Very confusing for people like me. This could indicate underactivation or the inefficiency in that visual word form area, as seen in dyslexia, where they have a delayed N170 which reflects impaired word form recognition. And getting stuck is difficulty with processing beyond these words. Often whenever I'm reading and I come across a word like this, I just get stuck. This is likely a bottleneck in the decoding, possibly due to erratic eye movements or those saccades, influenced by cerebellar Purkinje cells that dysfunction. And also remember the superior colliculus, which projects up to the frontal eye fields of the sensory motor area, the top middle of your brain, cortex area. This is heavily involved in kind of modulating eye movements. Sometimes those letters and the letter sequencing that form a word are very challenging. It's all due to that rapid visual processing and in combination with the lack of Purkinje cells. If the FWVA fails to quickly disambiguate these orthographic forms, it will delay this process, especially if the dorsal striatum involved with that procedural learning and the habitual word recognition, because remember the brain is predicting, so it's anticipating what this word might be versus what it is. So that wraps up the decoding or the orthographic processing, which is a very large and very complex first step. So the next step, the second step in reading is phonological processing. We touched on it a little bit with explaining the different kind of phenomena associated with reading, but let's just go into what phonological processing is really trying to accomplish. And this is including that temporal-parietal cortex and the superior temporal gyrus and the angular gyrus. So this is mapping visual words to their sounds, like mentally pronouncing book as book. This is like a translator converting text to speech in your head. And this is occurring at roughly 200 to 300 milliseconds in EEGs and MEGs. And the fMRI highlights STG and AG activation. The magnetic form measurement, the MEG, shows arcuate fasciculus mediated connectivity to the FWVA, and the EEG tracks the timing. The goal here is to link visual input to phonological output, enabling pronunciation and aiding with the comprehension. So here comes the sound. In phonological processing, the focus shifts to mapping the recognized word forms, remember with the predicting and reading, visualizing the words, the letter sequencing, to their corresponding sounds, and initiating the groundwork for speech. We're building up a foundation here to speak. This process primarily involves the temporal-parietal cortex. And we can speak this, or we can silently speak this, up to our cortex. Remember the Reza Shadmir episode. For speech, this sets the stage for articulatory planning in Broca's area, which coordinates tongue and speech movements. This is why I mentioned Dr. Shadmir again, because the Purkinje cells are involved in slowing the tongue down. And this was shown in his recent paper. The Purkinje cells refine timing and accuracy, while sounds and speech begin to form here. Actual vocalization, the speech, requires further motor execution during reading aloud. But before that, we must have the semantic integration, the inferior frontal gyrus. Remember Broca. A lot of people know about Broca. This connects words to their meanings, like understanding book as a reading object. This is akin to the library finding the right story. And this is occurring at 300 to 500 milliseconds. On EEGs or MEGs, fMRI reveals this activation of the inferior frontal gyrus. And the EEG tracks meaning processing, while the MEG maps frontotemporal connections. The goal here is to build coherent understanding, especially for the complex or abstract text. So silently speaking, that so-called subvocalization. In silent reading, readers internally articulate words like silently saying book while doing the reading. And this engages the superior temporal gyrus and the angular gyrus, while the fMRI shows the temporal-parietal activation. MEG confirms that articulate fasciculus connectivity. The goal here is to reinforce phonological processing, aiding comprehension by linking visual words to their auditory forms without overt speech. And the big thing here is we are teaching ourselves. We are speaking up and teaching ourselves, like professing. And this is a big form of learning. Reading out loud. This extends silently reading to vocalization of speech, requiring motor areas to articulate words and manage porosity, like reading book aloud with proper tone. fMRI shows increased motor and inferior frontal gyrus activation. EEG captures motor-related signals, and the MEG tracks articulation timing. The goal here is to produce accurate and fluent speech while maintaining comprehension. So let's put some oscillations on this part of the process here. In the VWFA, autistic phenotypes spot words much faster. And this is shown with that EEG, MEG, and that hyperactivation in fMRI. The delta here is autistics process this in gamma waves, while alpha and beta waves are used for non-autistic brains, making visual processing extra detailed. Sometimes we have called it heightened. But the connection to the inferior frontal gyrus, the storyteller, that Broca region, is weak. MEG shows low alpha and beta coherence, and EEG catches a delayed N400, meaning comprehension lags, especially for abstract stories. This should be all making sense to you, how autistics have difficulty with that downstream sensory processing and making sense of things and needing to catch up. We might have a hard time keeping up in social situations. And remember the speech and language episode with the two different types of echolalia, the two different sources of echolalia. One is keeping up, so you must repeat it. This should be all making sense to you, but I don't think people understand this, especially with assessing the autistic phenotype. This is heavily missed, and I'm telling you that. I know that. And should be no surprise here, the articulate fasciculus, that brain highway, remember with the FA measuring water, has reduced strength. It is a gravel road. It is a kinked water hose. From point A to point B destination example. Let's just use this analogy that we've mapped out here. There's a destination, point A to point B, and there's 5 stops. For the autistic phenotype, maybe the first 2 stops come fast versus the non-autistic, but the next 3 are delayed, while the non-autistic gets there much smoother. I have something exciting. I want to introduce a product unlike any other product available. A highlight is the product from Daylight Computer Company created their product based on these factors. The Daylight computer is completely blue light free. It has no flicker. Short wavelength flicker is extremely harmful for our eyes
and downstream biology. Light flicker is constantly turning our central nervous system on and off. Essentially, it is like going to a light switch and repeatedly turning it on and off. The problem is, blue light and LED light does this, and it is so rapid you cannot even perceive this in real time. The daylight computer is the lowest stimulation and foremost for sensory sensitive users. It is no question that the alternative product, especially when used at night, do not address or consider this in their product. It is so toxic to human biology. Big tech corporations have patents on how their short wavelength implicate the human nervous system. And a bonus, despite daylight computer not having backlight, it is very functional for outdoor use. And of course, increased sunlight is always preferred. I am happy to offer a discount for the daylight computer. You can use the code AUTISM for a $50 off discount. Again, use the code AUTISM and the discount code for $50 off. See the link in the show notes to Daylight Computer Company, or just give it a quick search in your internet browser. Use the code AUTISM for $50 off. I would like to mention Chroma, lights designed for humans. Chroma, a Seattle-based innovator founded by ex-NASA and Air Force engineer Michael Shapiro, is on a mission to enhance physical and mental health with purpose-built devices, unlocking peak human health, cognitive function, and performance. Shapiro launched Chroma to restore the natural light lost to screens in indoor living, and delivers faster recovery, sharper minds, and better sleep. Their products hit hard. The Iron Forge speeds muscle repair with red and near-infrared light, while the Skylight mimics sunlight to boost sleep and energy. A standout, the Forge lamp, is a portable gem that fires 660 nanometer and 850 nanometer light to energize mitochondria and heal tissues on the go. Remember the 4 red light chromophores on cytochrome C oxidase, frequently talked about in the podcast. This is why. Their products are built with military-grade durability that have lasting impact. Chroma's tech fuses precision and power. Gallium titride power supplies, smaller, cooler, and stronger than silicone, provide flicker-free light that's easy on the eyes. High-powered LEDs target key wavelengths for skin, tissue, and cellular health, with smart heat management for the lasting impact. Every design decision Chroma makes serves a purpose: to create devices that are precise, durable, and effective for improving human life. Remember, humans use different wavelengths of light for different functions of life. Remember when I ask, what do you think light is? Chroma designs with our biology in mind, from sleep aids and wound healing to mitochondrial energy, full body lights and blue light blocking glasses. They are US made and Chroma ships globally and accepts FSA and HSA payments. Use AUTISM at checkout for a 10% off discount. That's AUTISM at checkout for a 10% off discount.
If you are listening to the podcast, listening to the episode, please feel free to leave a review or rating. In podcasting, reviews, ratings, and downloads are huge, and I very much appreciate your feedback. You can contact me on X at RPS47586. We can discuss anything and everything about autism. I very much appreciate your comments and your interactions on X. You can check out the YouTube page for all the videos, full-length videos, shorts, and clips. You can email me, info.fromthespectrum@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to From the Spectrum podcast.